Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to find myself here with you all in Lyon in this fabulous room, which after yesterday's panel is starting to feel like a second home for me. I'd love to say my first home is even smarter, but I'm a writer, so that's obviously a lie. I've been asked to give a short introduction to today's session. It's a storytelling module about media brands. And I'll be your host for the next 90 minutes, hopefully without churning out too many chat show cliches like that one. My name is Wyndham Wallace, and I too am a media brand of sorts. With a name like Wyndham Wallace, you have to be. So allow me to give you a little bit of background about why I'm here hosting this session and what it's going to be about. As I said, I currently make my living as a writer, contributing regularly to publications like Quand, Classic Pop, and the Quietus website, and have previously written for The Guardian, Sunday Times, and BBC Music, amongst other places. Before that, I was a record company guy and a manager, running City Slang Records' UK office for 8 years before moving to Berlin, setting up a short-lived imprint on behalf of K7 called Ever Records, and managing Nashville singer-songwriter Courtney Tidwell and the considerably more successful Lee Hazelwood for a few years before his death. In July this year, I will be 42 years old, and it's a terrifying thought. I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s, too young to entirely understand the significance of punk as it happened. I was aware of a band called the Sex Bristles, whose record couldn't be played on BBC Radio 1, but that was about the limit of my experience. Instead, as I entered my teens, I enjoyed the music of the 1980s, a time that saw consumerism explode as affluence and wealth expanded beyond the upper and middle classes and trickled down, so they told us, to the working classes. After flings with Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Pet Shop Boys, I gravitated slowly towards what, back then, we used to call indie music. It wasn't like the indie music of today. Nowadays, that's just a word we use to denote that the music is performed by skinny white boys with guitars, whatever label they're on. But back then, indie was a status, something born of one's presence on a genuinely independent record label, and also a description of one's aesthetic. Indie musicians didn't subscribe to the major label corporate ethos of making money, but were instead driven by their need to make and share their music and their art, or so they said. But whether it was the 70s or the 80s, one thing remained true for pretty much all musicians of a certain type. Brands were dirty. Association with a corporate business was a no-no. Sure, it meant money, better distribution, more power to your elbow. But it meant you'd sold out. You'd sold out to the man. And the man was evil. The man was only there to make money. The man was more interested in the future of his business than the future of his artists. He had a brand to protect and promote, and this was something far bigger than music. When it came to music and other brands too, allowing your music to be used in advertisements was also out of the question. To work in alliance for someone for whom your music had no value except as a means of promoting their own business was unacceptable. When a then little-known band called The Shaman refused to have one of their songs used in a TV spot in, I think, around the early 90s, it made the newspapers, or at least Melody Maker and the NME, who praised them for their integrity. Only a few years later, Moby was castigated for allowing pretty much every second of his Play album to be used by anyone with a checkbook. Music and brands did not mix. But times were changing. In the UK, at least, the likes of Levi's had been appropriating old songs in their TV ads since 1985, and those TV ads were cool. Songs like Marvin Gaye's I Heard It Through the Grapevine and Muddy Waters' Mannish Boy rose to the top of the British charts. Familiarity bred contempt. Having your music used in an ad slowly became something that was acceptable, and soon enough became something desirable. People even forgave Moby. In fact, it soon became so attractive that by the end of the 1990s, I was working with a band who had allowed one of their songs to be used in a Levi's ad for which they'd been paid little more than £1,000. The reason for this was simple. Bands wanted to sell records, and to sell records they needed to be heard. Sure, allowing your music to be heard in a Levi's ad might mean that people always thought of it as the music from the Levi's ad, but if you were lucky enough, you could use this as a stepping stone to further wider exposure. There was then a far greater chance you could continue making music on the back of your success. Furthermore, people in the industry had stopped thinking of their acts as bands and instead actually began to think of them in terms of brands. This wasn't such a huge mental shift. People like me had been long investing in not only their favorite artist records, but also in badges and t-shirts, and posters, and limited editions that completed one's collection. These things lent music an identity. Boy George had worn boy t-shirts in the 1980s, and everyone wanted boy clothes. So selling one's music as a brand was simply the next logical step. Brand was essentially the new word for image. This change, however, wasn't due to a lack of integrity. It was simply common sense. Branding happened whether one wanted it to or not. Indie itself had become a brand. Rave had become a brand. Pop was a brand. Bands needed to compete for space and sales and use all means necessary to achieve their goals. Bands, quite simply, were the new brands. They had logos, they had merchandise, they had an aesthetic. And once the world had got used to this idea, consciously or subconsciously, what had once been unthinkable became compulsory. Brands were a vital part of not only music's culture, but its counterculture. Once the floodgates had opened, everyone tried to establish their own brand. It was no longer a dirty word. In fact, it's almost impossible to imagine anyone succeeding in anything musical without doing exactly this. And naturally, it's not only music to which this applies. Even as a writer, I'm encouraged to establish myself as a brand. I need to share my work on Twitter, on Facebook, via my own website, via Tumblr, via whatever means are necessary to mean that my name, Wyndham Wallace, is recognizable. That was Wyndham Wallace, www.wyndhamwallace.com, and I'm available for work. Don't forget that. Nowadays, there is, one could almost say, no success without a brand. But how does one create one? Does it happen by accident? Does one really need to work on that rather than simply ensure that whatever one is making is worthy of wider attention? Can one control one's brand? Might it not be better to actively eschew branding, or is that in itself a brand? What kind of person wants to work with a brand? How do they ensure its success? And does this still involve selling out? And what if the brand becomes something that no longer represents what it first set out to be? Is Apple, for instance, now so established that its brand has been diluted? Do we liberal MacBook users really want to be associated with a company that uses slave labor and makes net profits of normally at least $10 billion every 3 months? Or is the brand now so strong we turn a blind eye, just as people still buy Rolling Stones tickets even though they quite clearly can't play or sing anymore? Today I'm joined by 4 people who have established 3 bands, or helped establish, as some of the most influential in the world of non-mainstream music. They have enabled their brands to become a form of media, one that we trust. First of all, there's Pitchfork, represented today by Chris Kiski, a website started by one solitary individual, Ryan Schreiber, that has gone on to become such an authoritative source of information and opinion that it's one of the first ports of call for anyone trying to establish a musical act. Even a decade ago, few people would include a quote from Pitchfork, from a Pitchfork review in their marketing campaigns, but nowadays, a positive review from the site is almost obligatory if one is to succeed. With 5 million unique users every month, that probably helps, and Pitchfork has also established itself as a brand beyond the internet, hosting and curating festivals, expanding into online television, and launching Nothing Major, a new site devoted to what they call emerging visual culture. Resident advisor too, Paul here, has become one of the most visible brands in the world of electronic music. it started out in, and forgive me for my next comment, it started in Australia, of all places, not somewhere that one might expect such a prominent commentator on club culture to emerge. But when you're good at what you do these days, you can transcend geographical hindrances, like being on the upside down part of the globe, although Resident Advisor does indeed now have offices around the world. Indeed, nowadays the award-winning site sells tickets, partners up with clubs and events, and has even produced a number of short documentaries exploring local scenes in the electronic music world. If you want to know what's going on back in those dark clubs where I live in Berlin, or who's DJing there, or where to buy the tickets, or in fact buy the tickets, Resident Advisor is the brand to trust. In the case of the Red Bull Music Academy, represented today by two gentlemen from South Africa, who've come a very long way to speak for 15 minutes each, an already established brand has been used to promote events and activities that not only help empower musicians, but which then reflect well back on the company itself. Such a thing was once beyond belief. Even a few years ago, in a moment of self-righteous pomposity, I turned down the chance to write for a Red Bull website because I felt it was inappropriate, and because I can barely handle coffee, let alone a highly caffeinated soft drink. But when I was asked to contribute to their site earlier this year, I leapt at the chance. Red Bull had convinced me, winning me over and establishing itself in my mind as a brand that sought to promote themselves by helping others, something highly unusual in this vulgarly capitalist age. That, to me, made my decision acceptable. Not only that, but they paid well and paid on time, something that's often pretty rare for the freelance writer. Interestingly, since I conceded that the money that they'd offered me had also helped win me over, making me also an evil capitalist, I decided to see whether there were other haters out there. I typed in the words Red Bull Music Academy sucks into Google, but it brought up only one solitary site on the entire internet. The website, which was called Down a Peg, noted rather sweetly that Red Bull Music Academy is disliked by no one. Mind you, Resident Advisor and Pitchfork also had no dislikes either, so I don't know what that tells us, probably not a lot. So who are the people behind the brands? What had shaped their work? What's their work about? And how did they get to be in a position where they find themselves invited to tell their stories to a powerful journalistic media brand like Wyndham Wallace? When did the man become our friend and ally? What have we learned about brands? Joining us to help shed some personal light on important questions like these are Chris Kiski, President of Pitchfork, Paul Clement, the Director and Co-founder of Resident Advisor, and Ryan Famak and even Taranjanin, I got that right, didn't I? Taranjanin, cool, of the Red Bull Music Academy in South Africa. I'm delighted and excited to welcome them all here, and I hope that you will do too. I'll be spending a quarter of an hour speaking to each of the participants here before opening the floor to allow all of you, or as many as we have time for, to ask questions for the last 15 minutes or so of this session. But now, in something approaching the words of the once great, once wise Morrissey, it's time that the tale was told of how they took a brand and they made it gold. And I will begin by asking some questions to Chris here from Pitchfork. I think the first question is, after my poor attempt to define your brand, perhaps you could define what you think of as Pitchfork's media brand.
Well, we've spent a long time thinking about that and how to explain and answer that question. The simplest way to put it is Pitchfork is a music magazine. It doesn't have a print component, but as far as we're concerned, it's modeled after magazine culture and zine culture more specifically. We have spent a long time getting away from the trappings of the web in terms of whether it be semantics like blog or the ways in which you publish long-form content, and have really worked to become the experts and or a respected and trusted voice like you got to in your introduction within the world of music that we cover, which is founded on the idea that we never chose to nor want to be everything for everybody. Instead, become something that people trust and believe in and means something to someone. it's been I was the first employee at Pitchfork. I have been there for I think 11 or so years, where I started with Ryan Schreiber in his basement, and we now have, excuse me, over about 40 employees in two cities, and an audience, like you said, that is now pushing into the 6 million uniques per month across the world. So I don't know that I properly answered your question necessarily, but
that was a very, very succinct description of what Pitchfork is.
Yeah, I mean, a more mundane is we spend our days reviewing music. We have a music news section that we attempt to be as comprehensive as possible. We have, like you mentioned, we have a video channel called Pitchfork TV, and we have long-form features as well as a section that does act and perform like the MP3 blogs of old, ironically, in keeping up with what's happening at that moment on the internet or beyond. And it like I said, for a long time, online media was frowned upon because there was some sort of inherent value into putting words in print that is very romantic, but that was slightly irrelevant, and we were viewed as kind of punks and little shits on the internet that could do what we want. And half of it's true in that we could do what we want, and the other half is that we also wanted to build a respected and well-received and at least trusted, whether or not you agree with what we say, brand in terms of brand within music, and protect that integrity with whatever opportunity and or event that may arise.
So since this is a storytelling module, it might be useful to contextualize where you have come from and what your past is. If we can rewind right to the sort of early days for you, you want to maybe talk a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about, for you, kind of key moment, or a key moment of you where you realized that music was something that with which you really wanted to be involved.
Sure. So there was a publication in the U.S. I mean, it's an international brand, but called The Onion, and it's a satirical, they call themselves America's finest news source. But I had been there for a few years right out of school, and I had fallen in love with at least at that point what felt like a very independent-minded and independently run media company that was doing a lot of things that were non-traditional in many ways to what most media was doing at the time, whether it be focusing on the web more than focusing on the print component. And I fell in love with that, and having been a music fan before anything else my entire life, I had been reading Pitchfork and had been frustrated with Pitchfork for the my time at The Onion, and then before that, even back to when I was in school, because it was serving a purpose in that it was covering music that, whether it be zines that I paid attention to and read, or just the music scenes that I was either living in or experiencing. And it was the only place, or one of the only places you could find that was talking about it at great length and making a big deal about bands like Yo La Tengo or, the Wrens or anything that other more mainstream publications, whether it be in print or otherwise, just weren't paying attention to it. And it developed a trust through the reviews and through what the writers would be saying about music and the honesty with which they approached what they did, that I began to trust it as a source, not just for news and information, but as it helped me contextualize and discover music, and that was really exciting to me. But at the same time, it was a mess, and it wasn't consistently updated, and you could tell that it needed some work. And I had always been more business focused, albeit with creative goals in mind. And so I reached out to Ryan, who at that point had a small writing staff, and people were contributing on and off, and writers weren't being paid on time, which I know is that was mission number one to what you were saying, which is paying on time is important. That's getting way ahead. But I emailed him and I said, look, I would love to do all the things that you don't want to do, and I can tell that you're not focusing on. And I don't mean that out of disrespect. I just think that the trust that I feel and the feelings that I have towards Pitchfork, I know others feel the same way, and the sky is the limit with that, as long as we can do this the right way. And we spent a few hours on the phone. He hired me on the phone. It was very awkward, and I was like, well, I'm going to meet you first, because I have no idea what you look like and or are like, and I'm scared shitless of leaving a job for some dude to work in a basement with you, because that would be really weird, perhaps. So I said, let's meet for a beer, which then, of course, weirded him out. I'm like, okay, so do you not have beers, or what's the deal? He had a Diet Rum and Coke, I think, instead that night. But we sat, and jokes aside, our visions for what Pitchfork could become were the exact same. We recognized each other's strengths and where we complemented each other, and it was a relative kindred moment spirit where the stars aligned for both Ryan and myself, in that I knew what my purpose would be, and he knew that he could suddenly take what he had wanted it to become and know that someone else shares that vision. So from there, it was to create a brand and create something from day one that people trusted and meant something to people, and that wasn't, that focused on things that might not seem like the most logical focus, one of which being just music criticism in long form, At the same time that we were, let's bear down and do this, most print publications, and whether it be alternative weeklies or otherwise, were decentralizing and devaluing the criticism aspect of what they were doing in order to expand their coverage, to expand their audience. I imagine it was the thought process, and in most cases it worked probably. But try to check off all the boxes of what people might be interested with regards to media. And so suddenly you're like, okay, well, I used to read these guys because they said great things about music, and now first half of it is spent discussing politics or celebrity pictures, or I saw this person drinking at this bar, or whatever it might be. And music criticism was kind of just shoved to the back and relegated to 250 words, which, knowing what artists put into music and how much it means to people, it didn't seem like a very fair treatment of all the work that these artists were putting. They're spending so much time making this art. They deserve to be. They deserve someone to talk about it at length, whether it be good or bad. So I spent, we spent the initial time, obviously with getting aside from setting up an infrastructure and a process where we could treat both the writers and everyone that's involved in Pitchfork, properly and think ahead, as well as focus on what we felt we could do best, which is discuss and ignite and or provide context to and or discovery to music at large, and about music that was a little bit less traveled. You couldn't sit down at the dinner table with your family and they didn't know what you're talking about, really, and that was good. But at the same time, you could eventually put Jay-Z on the front page in the same breath as someone completely obscure, and it didn't matter. The playing field was leveled, and the internet leveled the playing field at first, and we were able to say, we could level that playing field with regards to our coverage, and we don't have to worry about anything. We're not beholden to a music industry. We're not beholden to anyone but ourselves and our audience, and by nature, of course, the artists that we're covering. And there's a lot of responsibility in that, and we wanted to take that very seriously and build it. So that was step one, I guess.
Did you, like myself, have a resistance to the idea of branding? Did you feel that this was a dirty thing and that you needed to be very, very cautious, or were you completely forthright and aggressive about it from the start?
We were never aggressive about the idea of branding Pitchfork. The idea of the word brand itself is very sterile and scary, like you've kind of got it. But at the same time, it's a necessary, it's a feeling and a vibe with regards to how we approach it. And when thinking about creating a brand, really what, my thing now is essentially like we want to be a trusted brand. Brand is just a catch-all term, in the same way as independence the catch-all term in many ways, But it was something like, let's not approach this really in a nasty way. Let's do this and it's more, how do we protect what we've got versus how do we grow what we've got? Because by protecting, there was an inherent belief that we could also grow it. So a lot of opportunities that would arise, we decided not to do, which from any traditional branding perspective would be illogical. But for us, that was our way of branding, is to stay closed in and kind of keep a low profile publicly, albeit with a loud voice, and go that way. I mean, the one thing we did lack was any tangible presence or tangible community that existed on our site, because we don't have comments. We were very insular and very much like, we're not necessarily a democracy in terms of how we create and publish our content. So, one of the first things that you could consider a branding initiative would have been, how can we think about Pitchfork in the real world? And we'd start at a festival. Paul and I were talking earlier about events, and a lot of companies do events, and it's important to the idea of branding. And we were I had come from a world where branding was definitely like just important, and then events, little, micro level events were very much a focus, and they're so expensive and kind of really annoying, and you don't know what they mean to people. So we just were like, fuck it, let's do a music festival instead for 20,000 people and have no idea what we're doing, and go for that and create a celebration of the music that we cover and a gathering of the community of people that pay attention to what we're doing and the artists are doing, and then it foster an environment where that's what it's all about, and that then of course that leads to, if you look at it with your brand hat on, a positive brand attraction and or feeling towards what you do.
I have to say that as an outside observer, for me, the Pitchfork Music Festival, which was in Chicago, I believe,
yes,
that seemed to me to be a tipping point for the site in terms of the profile it got. And part of the reason for that was perhaps because you'd waited so long and already established yourselves as a brand that it was, in a sense, almost overdue, which meant that you made a greater impact. I was actually going to ask, what do you remember about that day? Do you have fond memories of it, or was it frankly an absolute nightmare?
No, it was, organizationally it was not a shit show, thank God. We had very modest goals and continue to have modest goals. It was, to your first question though, it was a watershed moment in that it kind of encapsulated what music was all about to us, because you can put a review up or you can cover music and you watch people read it because you can follow it now analytically and quantitatively on the web. But putting a band on stage that no one in the world has heard of beyond a certain group of people, understandably so, and watching them play one of the largest shows they've ever played before and seeing the looks on their faces as you watch that, those are the most memorable things that I have from the first festivals that we've done. Is like, why can't Tortoise headline a music festival? Why is that abnormal? Why do we have to worry? Why do we have to even think about headliners? Why can't we just book a festival full of things that we like? And it was very idealistic, very anti-capitalist in that we didn't have expectations of making money. We just wanted to see if we could do it. So it was more of a challenge, and it was scary and silly, and we had never done necessarily anything in the most fiscally intelligent ways, if that makes sense. So we're more indulgent, and that was our way to indulge in something. And by doing that, and by doing it with what we also felt like, we've been to 1 million festivals. We know what sucks about music festivals and what's great about music festivals. So how can we borrow from that in the same way that bands borrow from inspiration as well? So it helped to create an environment that it was a tipping point in that people were like, wow, they can sell 20,000 tickets without placing an ad anywhere, and people will come to this thing and enjoy it, and it's really meaningful to all of these people. So suddenly it legitimized us in some ways to the people that had otherwise kind of bastardized us. But at the same time, that then translated to, I think, at the same time it was a good timing, because we had built a brand that meant something, and then suddenly it was like, okay, well, let's look deeper, and it introduced you to a new audience, and what you were saying suddenly it would resonate with more people ideally, and that continues to be the goal today with the festival.
I think it would be fair to say, though, that perhaps over the last few years there has kind of been a Pitchfork backlash where perhaps the site has been seen a little bit as sort of holier than thou, and that your opinions became so prominent and so important within the music industry that people reacted against it, perhaps in the same way as when Travis started selling 3 million records, they stopped being the rather sweet sentimental band and became shorthand for boring and middle of the road. How have you handled that, and was it something that you anticipated, that you felt uncomfortable with, or you just didn't care?
Well, Pete, I don't give a shit really, but yeah, backlash is not our fault. Like, all we did was say things that we thought. So it's the audience that decided to put their faith in what we've done. So you're responsible for that, but if the industry we don't even think about it. You have to be careful, and not be flippant and disrespectful, but if our opinions matter to someone or something, that we would hope that anyone would hope that to be the case about what they say, right? But that wasn't the weight with which they decide is completely not our call. Like, we said it. If you believe it or don't believe it, I can't necessarily control that. And if our audience gets bigger, then yes, inherently it's going to be heard by more and read by more people. So just shut that part of your brain down, and don't think about it. And really what we focused on, instead of worrying about any backlash or perceived over-importance of what we say, which again, people ask oh, what's it feel like being a tastemaker? And it's like, we don't even think about that stuff. Like that, the taste is being made by an audience that's doing it. They're the ones listening to the music. We're the ones reviewing it, but we never set out to be the only and or the most prominent voice, even though, in music criticism, because what we wanted to do is just cover music honestly as just music geeks, and the way with I think that resonates with people. So when that resonates, you're then even more responsibility to continue to respect that. But yeah, it's like the biggest decision that Ryan and I sat down with is at day one is the idea of, instead of worrying about backlash, worrying about the idea of cool, because cool is flaccid and it's generally fleeting, and it has an expiration date. And nothing about what we wanted to do, we wanted to be considered cool. Even though, you know, people could consider cool. You mentioned what you do or how you do it, whatever. Oh, that sounds cool. And I know that there's an inherent irony in that. You could say, isn't saying that you don't care about being cool actually cool? But that isn't the goal. You know, the goal is to create something that's good. And when music is inherently cool, as long as you're covering music that's good and covering it as well as you can, that transcends all trend. And the goal for us was, yes, shit, let's make sure we don't. People don't just categorize us as this thing that's popular and it's going to go away. You know, instead we'd rather be, let's bear down and be an institution that people can trust and believe in. And cool will just be the music at hand, you know, and that's what you deal with. So that was more of a focus than people having backlash against us.
Cool. Chris, your 15 minutes of media branding are now up.
All right.
Thank you very much, Chris Kiski from Pitchfork. We now turn to the South African Red Bull Music Academy representatives. Maybe you need to get that. Delighted to have you both here. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd probably like to start, I'm going to speak to both of you in turn, so you'll have to share the time equally in a democratic fashion. Perhaps you could maybe start by defining what the Red Bull Music Academy brand means to both of you.
For me personally, it was quite an interesting journey. I mean, I'm a DJ myself and an electronic music producer, and for about 3 years I actually tried to get into the Red Bull Music Academy. So, you know, living down south in South Africa, when I heard about the academy, for me it was like something really exciting. It was a bunch of guys that were into the same records that I was into, and I found that super appealing, and it was just very desirable to actually, you know, the thought of getting on a plane and going to hang out with a bunch of like-minded people was something that I was really into. So for 3 years I tried to get in, and I never made it. And then in 2003 it happened to be in Cape Town, which is my home city. And I applied that year as well. And they said to me, you almost got in, but we prefer you to work on the project with us. So it was kind of bittersweet at the time. And basically my role then was to integrate all the events. So Red Bull Music Academy came to Cape Town. My job was to find all the artists gigs to play. So for about a month we did 100 gigs. It was pretty insane. And obviously the one agreement I had with him then was like, listen, I really want to partake in these lectures that you're doing every day. And just the way, the understanding that's there, and you know, everything you guys have been saying, like kind of keeping the brand behind it, and not, you know, sort of putting logos everywhere. I just really respected what they were doing with music, and I fell in love with it, to be honest. Yeah, it's been an amazing journey since.
Well, my experience and what happened with the Red Bull Music Academy is fairly similar to mine. We were friends at the time, and I was busy, or what that time was about 1999. I DJ'd at this club, and the owner of the club actually moved down to Cape Town and actually started working for Red Bull. And he called me up and said, listen, there's this thing called the Music Academy, and I'd like you to speak to all the residents at different clubs and start getting them all to apply to the academy. So that was my kind of sort of birth into the Red Bull Music Academy, and I just really, really liked it at the time, and obviously entered myself for about 3 years and didn't get in. And then
we're not uniquely untalented.
Yeah, we're pretty good DJs. And then basically I went and worked on a project with the band down in Cape Town. I just spent a month or 5 weeks in Cape Town from Johannesburg, and from then on it was just a constant, every year repeating that, and speaking, being on the ears and eyes for the Red Bull Music Academy, and getting people, to talented musicians, soloists, whatever, to apply and educate them about that project, because it is an amazing opportunity.
I have a few friends who are musicians from South Africa, and one thing that became clear to me, and I don't wish to sound patronising when I say this, and I think they would agree with this, is that they had had a very sheltered existence in South Africa as musicians, and that in many ways the music scene that had been taking place there whilst they were growing up was way behind other, should we say, Western popular cultures. Did that mean in any way that the problems that I was talking about in terms of resistance to brands and stuff like that still existed very strongly because perhaps the culture was a little bit behind? Or did it mean that actually that had never existed in the first place, and the idea of Red Bull coming in and waving some cash around and trying to do good things was actually very, very welcome indeed?
Yeah, look, if you delve into the history of South Africa, you know, without going too deep, because it kind of always seems to come up, things like apartheid definitely had a huge effect on music in South Africa. Like growing up in South Africa in the late 80s and stuff, there were a lot of bands that just kind of refused to come to South Africa. And you know, with the sanctions and everything, we were pretty cut off from the rest of the world. That itself had quite a good effect on the musicians in South Africa, and the fact that a lot of musicians just really focused on their craft. So it was very difficult to go overseas and tour overseas, and the South African music culture just kind of bred itself. I think, you know, once apartheid ended and the sanctions were lifted and you know, bands started coming into South Africa, I think there was quite an excitement in the air, and certainly a lot of local talent started getting exposed internationally. I think it was a little bit before Red Bull's time where as I said, where this cross-pollination started happening. I think Red Bull, for me personally, was just, you know, they were one of the companies when we were starting out trying to do our things. They were a brand that were willing to come and promote pretty underground music. I mean, that's what we were into. We were pushing, you know, fairly obscure techno and electronica, and you know, to try and have a meeting with any other brand and try and explain to them like about techno was pretty impossible. You know, because the radio in South Africa is pretty ghastly. The commercial music is kind of everywhere. So, you know, Red Bull listened to what we said. We had to say. They had a uniquely international perspective on things. They, you know, when I mentioned artists, they actually knew who I was talking about. And yeah, it was just the one thing that really caught my attention straight away was that, you know, we would do an event and not have to put the Red Bull logo on the flyer. And I thought, fuck, that's cool. You know what I mean? These guys are genuinely into the music. Yeah.
Wish to add anything to that?
I think it just was where they were not interested they're more interested in feeding the culture above their own needs. The one hand definitely holds the other, but nurturing a scene from a cultural perspective seemed of high priority to the people that we were working with, which was extremely attractive. That was well, it sounds like a good idea, and it's something that will grow and grow and grow, and it's definitely helps, you know.
I mean, I have to say that as an observer, I see what the Red Bull Music Academy does, and I'm genuinely really rather impressed by it, and frankly I would love to go to New York and attend the Academy this year. But the one moment, whilst I was researching our discussion today, the one moment where I took a step back and had to swallow hard was having seen all this activity, which on one hand seemed very, very altruistic. I then read that they make a profit of $4.2 billion per year. So putting a little bit of money into training a bunch of musicians every year and getting a huge amount of credibility out of that seems like quite a good deal. Did you ever kind of, and I don't wish to give you a hard time about this, but did you ever at any point question whether or not this was the right thing to do, to associate yourself with a brand that you didn't even define, that was being defined for you and which you then had to represent?
Yeah, like in my opinion, I think especially, and I think it's why we as South Africans are here today, living in South Africa, we could not have achieved what we achieved without Red Bull as a brand. You know, like, it's not just the money, it's the fact that there was a belief in what was happening in our country, there was a long-term vision, and the fact that, you know, we are faced with many challenges in South Africa. Economically, like, I mean, people just don't have money, to be honest. And, you know, like, when I first took the job, there was like a sense of like, you know, I said to myself, well, why is Red Bull getting involved in, you know, I mean, we're doing like really amazing projects in townships. So I say to myself, well, you know, why is Red Bull doing stuff in a township where these guys don't stand a chance of affording one can of Red Bull? And, you know, as I said, when you look at the long-term sort of goal and the long-term belief in the projects, and, you know, I started with the Red Bull Music Academy. I then, when the Red Bull Music Academy left South Africa, it left behind a recording studio. And what we've done with that recording studio for the last 8 years is give artists free recording time. And there's something inherently cool in being able to find young kids that have no access to, no means, bring them into a recording studio and hear the music that comes out. And for me, that's ultimately what it's about. Brands aside, it's what comes out the speaker. And I think there's a lot of sort of global interest in South African music right now, especially the electronic music. Like, look at someone like Black Coffee and the house music that he's making. And you know, I do a lot of work with Black Coffee, and it's amazing sitting next to these guys. And there's you know, there's this inherent rhythm in the people of South Africa, you know, and it's an amazing place to be musically. So yeah, I think, yeah.
Did you have any issues with it for the same reasons? Or?
No, I didn't have any issues with it. I mean, I think you need to separate a can of Red Bull from the projects that they're involved in. It's completely two different things. I don't actually try and merge the two, thinking they're making billions of dollars of profit. Well, they're helping us get our music out there, and you know, one hand washes the other, and you know, they make the product, and just, I really don't see the connection. As Ivan mentioned, the studio is just an amazing platform for anybody can go in there and just to watch like the content that comes out that we would never have, anybody would have ever heard before without that platform.
So you would definitely see yourselves as developing the brand of Red Bull Music Academy as opposed to Red Bull.
Exactly.
One of the things that another thing I did whilst I was preparing for this was to watch the documentary about Richie Hawtin's visit to South Africa, which is a really rather touching 15-minute documentary. I think 15 minutes? Or did it just pass by so fast that it seemed 15 minutes? But one of the things that came out of that for me was I felt as though it gave me a sense of what music is first and foremost, which is a unifying force. Something that brings together people, and whether I was watching videos of people in the townships dancing and Richie looking slightly bemused but rather touched by the whole thing, or whether I was seeing people dancing in the clubs, in a sense this could have been anywhere. And I felt that was perhaps what made the Red Bull Music Academy so good, was that it brings people from around the globe together and shows them that music is something special and something that unites us all. Was that perhaps something that was important to you as well?
Well, I think those kind of projects that we do is very interesting. It first kind of started 10 years ago, where during the Red Bull Music Academy in Cape Town, Austin Lada just wanted to play a gig, and we just set up some turntables outside this little tavern in the ghetto and played music for the afternoon. And then it was a couple of years later, and Carl Craig was actually out for an event, a J&B event or something like that, and he said to Ivan, I'll take the gig, but I want to do a gig in the ghetto. And Ivan and myself just went into the ghetto, closed off the streets, took power out of a light post, set up some speakers, and put some decks out in Carl Craig and Waterloo, played for 3 hours. And people just from all over kind of found out about this. It wasn't marketed, it was just word of mouth, and that's how it started, and that's where what happened with Richie Hawtin. And it's just an amazing, there's no Red Bull anywhere. No one knows that was provided by Red Bull, or Red Bull facilitated in making that happen. Or we did it because we're into that music and it's a special thing. We didn't do it because we're trying to promote a brand. So that's, the Richie Hawtin one was an amazing experience. It was probably the best days it was exceptional.
Yeah, I just have to say the same thing. You know, for Ryan and I right now, probably the most exciting work we're doing is in the townships. You know, in the past couple of months, we had Richie Horton come through, we took Skrillex through, and most recently Luciano. And it's just been we did a show with Little Dragon in Soweto as well. And the amazing thing is with these high profile artists is obviously it's all done for free. So that, you know, we there as Red Bull to provide infrastructure. We bring in, you know, a sound system. We bring in everything that can let the party happen. There's no branding. You know, I don't like to put Red Bull logos everywhere. I think it's rather crass to go into a township and then all of a sudden try and brand it. But you know, having thrown events in South Africa for close to 20 years, you know, I remember at the Cold Credit gig turning to Ryan, and this sounds terribly cheesy, and I just said, you know, look at the dance floor. This is the Rainbow Nation. You know, we had white kids get in a bus, drive in from the suburbs into the township, and they were on the dance floor, coming together with the black people of South Africa. And, you know, when the whole apartheid thing ended, that was the promise made to us. You know, bringing the nation together. And it's 10 years on, and it really hasn't happened. And when I look at those dance floors, for us, it's the first time we really see black and white people coming together in South Africa. And it's why music is so powerful, and why we've devoted our lives to it.
As representatives of Red Bull Music Academy, have you ever been restricted in what you can and can't do in terms of either with the Academy itself or in terms of your own activities outside as musicians and producers and DJs?
It is quite tricky, to be honest. You know, as Red Bull, we don't like to talk about what we do. You know, it's always a lot better for what we term opinion leaders, like artists, kind of talking about what it is that we do. But I think, you know, I mean, to be honest with you, I had to go through a lot of red tape to be on the couch here today, to talk about what we do. Because, as I say, Red Bull just prefers to let the actions kind of speak for themselves, as opposed to putting somebody on a couch to talk about like the cool stuff that Red Bull's doing. Other than that, I would say no. I think the environment that surrounds us has been built by us. So Red Bull has entrusted us over the last 10 years to sort of take them credibly into South Africa, and I'm really chuffed with the work that we're doing. And I think, you know, just being here today is like, you know, an amazing feeling that, hey, the world is starting to really understand and see what we're doing. So yeah, it's really a really exciting time for us, to be honest.
Have you ever felt restricted, or have you been restricted in what you can do in your terms of your own activities?
I think it's more the other way around, where we are kind of sort of, we doing our projects, and Red Bull comes in from the side and holds your hand, where we restrict in terms of our own projects how we want to do it. We guide the process. In terms of the academy, I mean, it's never been a scenario of like every party or event we throw, we have Red Bull Music Academy next to it. It's just Red Bull comes and facilitates for our projects. They trust us, as Ivan said, to get them into the market. You know?
I mean, I have to say, having spoken to you, I've never been more inclined to drink a sugary, syrupy drink, but I kind of wonder why it is that more companies don't take a similar approach. I mean, imagine if you could imagine that the banks started doing the same with their profits, perhaps we might be more inclined to trust them. Why do you think other companies don't take a similar approach and put something back into communities rather more efficiently?
I think it's where Red Bull were clever was the long-term vision. I don't think any other brand. I've worked with a lot of brands in the last couple of years. No one's really willing to take a chance. Like, if I took you to one of the first parties we were doing and you heard the records that were being played, you would not throw money at it. I believe they had a long-term vision and just really trusted what we were doing. I think if you look at Red Bull in a whole, they had so many learnings through their whole sport, or through the sporting side of things. You know, so instead of taking their budgets and doing above the line campaigns and stuff like that, they'd rather create cool content, and that's now shifted into a cultural realm where, you know, we'd far rather be putting together a cool piece about black coffee. Like the last film I just did with him was him performing with an orchestra at Heritage Square in Soweto. And you know, putting a video together like that, you know, for us it's just so much cooler than, you know, running an ad on TV.
It seems to me in a way that perhaps one of the reasons why the Academy has been as successful as it has been because, as you say, they don't over-brand. Is that not a lesson that we could all perhaps learn, that if we don't wave things in people's faces so aggressively, we might perhaps like them a bit more?
Yeah, I think you know, this digital age that we live in where we're bombarded by music and visuals and everything kind of getting thrown at us these days, I think if you look at everyone sitting on the couch today, everyone has quite a reserved approach to what they do. And I think, you know, for me, it's come down to credibility. Like, why do you read Pitchfork? Why do you read Resident Advisor? Because you know you can there's a trust there. And I think that's where Red Bull has been quite successful, is there's a trust in what it is that they're doing. Yeah.
Well, we generally with our own projects come against that, like up against that problem quite often, especially when you approaching sponsors for your event or festival. Or, you know, we have this mentality in South Africa where it's just marketing 101, where it's like, okay, well, we want our logo bigger than your logo on the flyer, and they don't understand that concept that you can't take away from the experience. People are there to experience an event. When you've got an inflatable Heineken bottle on the stage, it takes away from the experience, and bands don't generally endorse that kind of thing. It is very difficult to get an understanding about that scenario. So with Red Bull, you don't face that problem, you know, which is thankful, actually.
And what are your goals for the Academy in South Africa in the future? I mean, do you have any specific things inside at the moment that you're able to discuss that will enable the brand to be furthered?
I think for me, kind of the most exciting part of where we are right now is the music coming out of South Africa. So as I said, with the studio project that we're running, kind of looking for really cool music in South Africa, we've actually got it to a point where we are releasing compilations. I've actually got a couple here, so if any of you guys would like to take one home, I've got a couple at the back. But for me, that I feel like there's one last link missing. Like as a South African, I believe that we're sitting on the best music on the planet right now, and it's untouched. There's one of our biggest exports, someone like Black Coffee. I had a meeting with his management the other day, and I said, guys, it's really quite bad that when I log on to Beatport, I cannot buy one of your songs. So I think there's this one last step that as South Africa and as a nation that we need to take is just getting our distribution right. And I think we've spent so many years kind of crafting the sound and the artists in South Africa. I really feel the next step is exposing it to the world and letting the music actually get to the four corners of the earth. And it's slowly starting to happen, but I think we're on a tipping point right now where I think, especially even this year, I believe at ADE they're doing a focus on South Africa as well. And it certainly feels like a tipping point for the scene.
I think the last question that I need to ask is, what impact has this actually had on Red Bull sales in South Africa?
You know, I sit in on a lot of those meetings, and you know, we do a lot of study analysis and TMS results and stuff like that, and the results are there. As I said, it's, you know, the work that we're doing right now in the townships, we don't expect there to be a turnaround result. So we throw a party there and expect there to be lots of sales. It just doesn't work like that. But if I look at sort of the projects that I've been running for the last 3-4 years, they are definitely having an effect on the sales. You know, my job right now with Red Bull in South Africa is to get people to understand that Red Bull, in a credible way, is doing amazing things for music in South Africa. So I kind of see the sale of the can sort of secondary. But you know, when you look at the science involved, so as an example, we run a Red Bull studio stage at a festival. if we're not at a festival, our sales, the stage itself is not at a festival, the sales are kind of cool. But the minute we put the stage in there, people are seeing a Red Bull studio stage, the sales go through the roof. So there for me, there's a very direct result. So it's certainly, it does work.
And are you drinking a lot of Red Bull yourself now?
I do like it, but I only stick to about 4 a day.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ryan and Ivan.
Thank you.
It's now time to turn to Paul Clement from Resident Advisor, who has very kindly joined us, not all the way from Australia, it has to be said, just a short trip from London, where you're now based. Perhaps you could also begin by defining the Resident Advisor brand as you see it, as opposed to the rambling manner in which I introduced it.
I'm not sure I'm I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain us as a brand in a not so rambling manner, because we didn't start what we started with a brand, logo, goal, project in mind. It's just something that, on the other side to the Red Bull world, came at it the other way. We grew, and a brand evolves and develops, but that was always simply focused on electronic music.
What, I mean, obviously you must have been a passionate music fan to be spending so much of your life now involved in music in one form or another. Were you always an electronic music fan from an early age? Or?
In my high school days, I was personally listening to a combination of weird, well, not weird, like rap and hip hop, and hardcore, like underground, happy hardcore mixtapes, you know, Gabba from Rotterdam, techno, whatever. Like, it was a pretty mixed bag. But they were the two paths that I kind of went down when I was in high school.
I mean, you weren't essentially a writer as such, were you, when you started getting involved in Resident Advisor? Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, and I'm still, my editorial skills leave a lot to be designed. And I was thinking about this just recently, because I don't do many of these sorts of things, but and we don't really talk about when we started and how we started, but when we originally did start, it was literally an off-the-cuff conversation between a few friends who were like, oh, hey, we're starting this thing, we're going to create a website about music, do you want to get involved? It's like, yeah, sure, why not? Like, at the time I was working at a creative agency, and I come from a technical creative background. I was working in an agency in Sydney, studying full-time business and computing degree that was crammed into 2 or 3 days a week, and then we started this thing on the side. So it was a pretty intense period for a couple of kids in Sydney. I mean, I was 20 to 21 at the time. 2 of the other guys were around the same age, and Nick, I think, was 19. But of the 4 of us, 2 of the guys left within the first 6 months or so, because it was quite a big project with very limited returns, if any, for a long period of time. So,
what was the site like when it first started?
Funnily enough, I mean, I think the only thing that changed after the first year or so, because it was news and features and reviews and that magazine ideal that sites like Pitchfork have, but we always had the listings and the venues and that sort of submission process and things like that. So combining the services and the listings for artists and record labels with the editorial side has always been the core. The main sections have barely changed, which is still surprises me.
Was it firmly based, like focused on Australian culture to begin with?
So that was what I was getting to. The one biggest thing we had to spend a bit of time working on was removing, we had an Australian bias there would be Australian artists and international artists. And within the first 6 months to a year, I moved to the UK, and it was the first time I'd lived overseas for a period, and it opened my eyes in terms of being able to see to see it from an English person's point of view, or someone in the US. It's like, why would they have an Australian? Local news was Australian for that initial period. So it took us a couple of years to technically remove that local bias, but also change people's opinion or their ideals for what we were, who we were, what our brand was, where we were based. And we spent a long time trying to keep that balance quite widespread, international.
Was there a particular point when you realised that you were actually making an international impact? And if so, what were the signs that that was taking place?
There's no specific one moment. I mean, from the beginning, and it's still the same now. That first time you get mentioned somewhere, and I don't know if Pitchfork went through the same things, but when you get mentioned in the real world in a paper or in something which the first time was in a local street press in Sydney, that stuff's always exciting, and maybe that grows into wider media and bigger exposure, and the independent papers or whatever. It's just been a long process and a stepping stone of constant development, excitement, all that sort of stuff. I think as a bunch of kids in Sydney doing a party in Miami was one of the first, it would be crazy if we, made it to the US and did something there. Hosting events and starting to do events was one of those things that we did not to make money, because I'm pretty sure we very rarely, if ever, make money, and on an average, I'm sure we lose money on events, but it was to connect with people in the real world, to move beyond something you click on the internet into into a real thing, even if it's only a couple hundred people in a little club in a city once every couple of years.
You were telling me last night about the rather slick, splendid new offices that you have in London, which you've recently spent time building. Could you maybe just briefly compare and contrast the first office that you had as resident advisor back in Australia with what you now have in terms of offices around the world?
I think you're mistaking us for a company that had money when we began.
I'm not.
It was 5 or 6 years before we ever had an office. So, when we launched it, it was in our living room in Sydney. And the entire first stint I was in London, which was almost 5 years, I was working at a creative agency for that whole period full time. We were doing this on the side, mornings, working till 3 a.m. It was quite a long, hard road. And it wasn't until I left London, and I was back in Australia for about 18 months before moving to Berlin. We set up the office in Berlin, and at that point, we had a few people full time. The office, which is still there, fits around 8 people or something, and it's a nice space. I think the guys are pretty happy there, and I certainly am when I'm back. But it was quite a long road of people working from home, people working in disjointed ways, and having the physical space to be together really helped us move forward. And the affordability of somewhere like Berlin was important to making that happen.
And you have offices where now exactly? Around the globe?
So just after we opened office in Berlin, we opened office in London, which was in a friend's living room while he was at work randomly. That didn't last too long. And we moved twice up until the place we moved to now, which will hopefully be longer term. We have a couple of people in Tokyo, a little office there, which is somewhat of a shoebox. and we last year opened a permanent office in Ibiza, just on the basis of supporting the partnerships and things we have out there.
You moved into selling tickets on behalf of events and also actually running your own events and such like. When you started doing those things, was that a kind of conscious attempt to market the resident advisor? I mean, I hate to call it a media brand, but yeah, the resident advisor media brand, or was that just more a business opportunity for you to try and help fund the site?
Yeah, I mean, ticketing, I think in an ideal world, and I envy what Pitchfork have in its, I was telling Chris yesterday, like relative simplicity, because managing and maintaining event listings, venue listings, artist profiles, like even if you can give the power to the industry to maintain that, takes a lot of work. One of our biggest challenges is working locally and having listings that work locally everywhere, whether you're in Lyon or London or wherever. And as that started growing, the listings, you know, it was basically sort of doubling or tripling for quite a few years, and was still sort of growing at a relatively rapid rate. It was just a no-brainer. I mean, you know, the promoters were there, the people using the listings. Listings become such an important part of, you know, how people find events, where you go to do that. I've always had because I commented from a technical background, the ideal of you know, if Google was to produce a ticketing service, how would that work? And, you know, in the same way that we've empowered a lot of people to manage a lot of content online, we built this ticketing system in the same way. And that happened after I left London the first time and I was back in Australia. That was my sort of leap of faith into going full-time. It was a nice synergy that Dave, one of the guys that started the company with us, who left early on, wasn't happy in his job. We worked together programming for quite a few years, and it was someone that we could trust. We're like, hey, you know, there's a simple opportunity to build a nice system that can work and can be, you know, as respectable to the audience and the industry that we have. You know, we want you to come back on board, work with us on this. At the time we were, well, I was basically personally working in Melbourne out of a study at the flat that I was living in, redeveloping the site in .NET to the current site we have now. Basically recoding the whole thing from scratch by myself as a relatively low-level experience. And getting Dave on board was good at that point, and it all made sense, but it was, yeah, that was kind of a turning point in us taking it a lot more seriously. We had, at that point, we still had a few people full-time, but yeah, it was an interesting year. And then Dave was also planning to move back to Europe, but he didn't know where. Then when we were talking about, well, I was always moving to Berlin once I was back in Australia, and you know, he decided to come over, and then it all kind of fell in place. Just after we got the office there, we stumbled upon Todd Burns, and he came on board, and it kind of all fell together.
I'm curious to know whether or not you were being flippant when you mentioned that perhaps the events that with which you're involved are not necessarily profit-making, and I noticed also that you kind of smiled wryly when Paul said that. I was sitting here yesterday with Jonathan from DFA and the Hacker and Alex from Good Life, and both of them had talked about how they, as record labels, were being forced to put on events in order, in many ways, to actually fund the releasing of the records that one would have thought was the primary source of financing for a record label. It kind of seems a bit weird that you guys are putting on events and are losing money, perhaps, from them. I mean,
most of the time we don't lose money. It's just that we don't go into events with a big profit margin on the table. in the case of a DFA or something, you know, the artist fee is a big part of it, or revenue, especially when we're doing events, because we're always trying to push it as far as we can in terms of who we can afford, how much time we've got, and a lot of the times, you know, we're favouring the venues that we like going to, and a lot of the time they're smaller, a couple hundred people, you know. And if you've ever done a party, you know, the financial side, unless you've got a take on the bar or something, for a party with a couple hundred people isn't that great. I think it was the party we did in Barcelona a year or two ago. The best case scenario saw us lose a couple €1,000. That's not, we definitely don't go into events with that in mind. It would be great if it was, you know, if it at least broke even at the end of the year, but we enjoy doing events. We work with venues that we like. In the case of something like a Trouw in Amsterdam, which is a great club, fits a lot of people, but there's not that much benefit in us taking risk on door and cover or whatever. We'll work with the club, programming a lineup that we want to develop. And, you know, we didn't get into this thing to make a lot of money. I'm sure I could have probably done quite a few things and gone home easier, but, you know, yeah, it's never been about money. And I think if we can afford to do what we do creatively, pay writers, produce great content, you know, make films and things, ideally without brands in the sponsorship and support sense, but there's that necessary evil in terms of sales and advertising, brand-related partnerships, sponsorships, event-related things. You know, a lot of the times, in the same way that Red Bull works, like, without those things, some of the most difficult creative things we love doing wouldn't happen. So, you know, advertising is a great revenue stream. It works quite well.
One last question for you. Resident Advisor has obviously come a huge, long way since you first sat down in that living room after a short, cursory, off-the-cuff conversation about doing a website, and has now become pretty much the go-to site across the world for information about electronic music. What would you say are perhaps the three, maybe I don't have to ask you for specifically three, but the key qualities that have made Resident Advisor so significant on such a global scale as a brand?
I think one of the natural one, and the one that we're always, I think the thing I'm most proud of with what we do is that, you know, we're not beholden to mega headliner on the front page, you know, in a traditional magazine sense, in the same way that Pitchfork can write about whoever they like and they can dictate, you know, that level playing field. But being able to put a random artist from some corner of the world that no one's ever heard of in the spotlight is, you know, probably the most exciting thing. In terms of, I think the independence between advertising and editorial, which is something a lot of traditional magazines have struggled with, and a lot of PR people still don't seem to understand. In the same way you work with an artist or a label and they expect, because you've done something with them, that their review is going to be positive or that they're guaranteed coverage or something. Yeah. It
seems to me that the one thing that unites everybody here is really, in a sense, a kind of trust and independence. So I think this is the part where I round up the official me asking questions section and thank Chris and Paul and Brian and Ivan. And I open up the floor at this point to anybody. We've got about 10 minutes or so if anybody wants to ask questions. If you want to raise your hand, and I can bring the microphone over you. It'd be nice for me to stretch my legs. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi. I have a question for the Red Bull guys. Finally, how many artists did the Red Bull label sign from now? And did you make any money with that?
Yeah, sure. The Red Bull Records is kind of its own separate project, which is run out of LA at the moment. I think they're sitting on about 4 or 5 artists, and there has been success with most of the artists, in fact. So AWOL Nation is probably the best example, has played all over the world, and I wouldn't say that it's self-sustainable yet. It is making money, but it's once again, it's a kind of a long-term vision on the ownership of music. Because right now, Red Bull, besides Red Bull Records, everything else that Red Bull does often leaves the ownership of the music in the artist's hands. So Red Bull Records is the first time where it's acting exactly like a record label and publishing and owning the music rights. So yeah.
Was it me? Yeah. I have a question for the Red Bull Academy people as well. You mentioned the fact that in the case of South Africa that they'd left behind a studio. I think one of the typical things, like in Europe, we have this European capital of culture, and there's always a lot of talk about what afterwards, you know, what is left behind in tangible, concrete kind of facilities that can be used for the next generation coming through. So I guess I have two combined questions. Is it typical that after they leave the whole city that there is some infrastructure or some, you know, something concrete left behind? And secondly, what are the considerations that you think about when you're choosing the whole cities? I mean, how far in advance are those decisions made?
South Africa was actually the first time that a recording studio was left behind, and since then it has kind of been a tradition. Like when Red Bull Music Academy sort of comes into town, they look for like normally a fairly kind of derelict building. So there's a lot of investment in the actual shape and structure of the building itself. Because of the academy, you know, having 60 participants there making music over a month, it's important to have these facilities. So for the first 5 or 6 years, these studios were being built and then just dismantled. And in 2003, when I was in Cape Town, they came along, they built the studio, and then they actually left. And it was actually the marketing manager, who kind of insisted that they didn't dismantle the studio. And only a year later did Red Bull Music Academy come back, and they did a project called Class of Its Own, brought like Aloe Black and a bunch of producers, and made music in the studio. And that was the first time the studio was left behind. And since then, they you know, having seen the results and kind of the legacy that's left behind, they went on to do it in London. Rome, I believe's got one as well. Madrid's got one. So yeah, Red Bull Music Academy right now is happening in New York. And as far as I know, they were just saying that the studios that they built in New York are pretty much most sophisticated yet. So yeah, it's a beautiful side of the project actually. And the second part was?
And just about how you chose the whole cities and how far ahead that was kind of planned.
I think the planning's done about 2 years in advance. I think, you know, the thought process behind it is kind of musical, really. I know when you know, when they came to South Africa, it was because, you know, it was really at the birth of when this amazing African house music was coming out. And I guess it's two main guys, Marnie and Torsten, who actually started up the academy, and they're like absolute tastemakers. So they're very much ahead of the curve and able to spot these sort of pockets of culture developing, and they look to try and find you know, creative and inspirational places. I know when I went, you know, I think the first time we did North America, they ended up choosing Seattle. And just, you know, I managed to go along and experience Seattle, and it's just the one cool thing about the academy is it's based on a mindset. I find personally, you know, there's groups of individuals that are passionate about music all over the world, and the academy looks to find those people and connect the dots. I think one of the things that I value most in my job right now as a Cape Town representative of Red Bull Music Academy is that I can basically phone the guy doing the same job as I am any part of the world, and it's just the best way to access the city. Like, so if I go to Spain, Madrid, I would phone up the Spanish counterpart, and you know, straight away you have a guy on the ground who is into what you're into. He's going to take you to the best restaurants. He's going to show you the best sneaker stores. And for me, it's like the coolest network that exists in the world right now. I'm really grateful for that.
Does anybody else have a question? Okay, then in that case, I think the time has come to thank Ryan and Ivan, and Chris and Paul, and obviously yourselves for coming, and I hope that you've found this an informative and educative hour and a half. Thank you very much.